Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today still in the first book. We're looking at chapter 5 of the first book. As we noticed, chapter 4, we were looking at slavery, this is where he kind of develops the concept of natural slave. It starts at the end of chapter 3, where at the very end he makes it. There's two assertions. One is that whether there is this, that it's wrong that that everyone holds that, political rule, economic rule, household management, uh, 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 mastery of slaves, monarchy, kingly rule, and political rule are not the same. Again, something he addressed at the first part. He said this is something that people assume that they're the same, but they're not. And this is what he addressed in chapter 1. Now at the end of 3, he says that's one thing. And the other thing is that people who argue that there's no slave by nature. All slavery is conventional. And in 4, he kind of raises what slavery means. He defines what slavery means. He defines it as if a slave is a person who is a tool. And there's two types of tools for action and tools for production. He suggests, in this sense, and then the question of what is meant by a slave by nature. Okay, now we're going to continue this. This is how he's going to end. This is going to be looking at the question of what is meant by a slave by nature, right? So, chapter 5. Whether anyone is of this sort by nature or not, and whether it is better and just for anyone to be a slave or not. But rather all slavery is against nature, must be investigated next. So this is the question you're going to investigate. Whether one question is that is there anyone who is a slave by nature or not? And then whether it is better and just for anyone to be a slave or not to be a slave. That's the second thing. But rather all slavery is against nature. Now these questions must be investigated. These three things. But it's not difficult either to discern the answer by reasoning or learning it from what actually happens. So therefore, it is not difficult to do what actually happens, right? Now he says, okay, this ends the first kind of section. Again, these are not what Aristotle did. These are kind of divisions within probably William Morbic's editing of it. This is part of the edition of this, the manuscript editings of giving the numbers of within the chapter. These aren't sets, ruling. So number 2, ruling and being ruled belong among not only necessary things but advantageous things. So he distinguishes between what is necessary things, the necessary things, and the advantageous things. Necessary things that need must be. In other words, life or existence cannot. Without it, other things cannot be. In other words, the good and. In other words, this is a precondition in order to have what is beneficial, or what is good, or what is what It is the preconditions like life. Mere life is something that's necessary. You need to deal with this. The good life is a type of life. It's the kind of life. The kind of life you are is going to be a variety of life, but mere life is a precondition. It is something that is necessity. Without it, the other thing cannot be. So therefore, here he's talking about the question of what is necessity as a precondition, that is the foundation by which the advantageous rests. Okay, so he says ruling and being ruled is not only about the necessary, but it's also about the advantageous. And immediately from a birth, certain things diverge, some towards being ruled and others towards ruling. So there's okay, anything that, in other words, he makes this argument. This is also tied to those animals account. There's going to be those who are So therefore, the question of who is rule is both a question of necessity and also a question of advantage, right? So the first question here, he seems to argue, is that okay? Immediately from birth of something, an animal or an entity, there's going to be a divide. It's divided between those who rule and those who are those who some towards being ruled and others towards ruling. Now he says there are many kinds of things, both ruled and ruled, and the rule is always better over ruled things that are better. In other words, and for example, over a human being rather than a beast. Okay, semicolon. So there are many kinds of things, both ruling and ruled, and the rule is always better over ruled things that are better. For example, over a human being rather than a beast, comma, for the work performed by the better is better, and whatever something rules and something is ruled, there is a certain work belonging to these together, these things together. So therefore, in other words, the idea here is you're doing something. In other words, there's some work, there's some action or activity or thing being done, and therefore, in his argument here, it is, and given that there's something to be done here, it's better that the thing that you're doing with is performed. In other words, it's higher the better, right? He says that the work performed by the better is better. So therefore, for example, a human being rather than a beast. Okay, so the question is that okay, now this is interesting that okay, it's more preferable to have a. He seems to suggest here that for a certain kind of thing, it's more preferable to have a human being than a beast doing certain kind of labor because why the human being has is a human being and therefore has judgment, has sense. Now, a natural slave doesn't have judgment and sense. But again, even the argument here is that even a natural slave is better than mere animal. He's a human being, nevertheless. Okay, um, so therefore, that's the kind of interesting point he's making here. That something is, in other words, that the question of the rule is always better over ruled things that are better. In other words, he goes that therefore, the example of a human being than a beast. For work performed by the better is better. In other words, the work performed by the better being is better. Now, this what kind of work is it? Yeah, no, this is okay. This is a reasonable point he's making here, right? Straightforward, reasonable point. This is not that controversy. Um, and whenever something rules and something is ruled, there's a certain work belonging to these things. So, in other words, there's a work, there's some activity, there's some action. There's something going on here, right? The ruling and ruled. For whatever is constituted out of a number of things, whether continuous or discrete, and becomes a single common thing, always displays a ruling and ruled element. So anytime you have this, this is a very important point. Anytime you have what he says here, something is constituted. So once you have a whatever you have something is constituted out of a number of things. So a composite whole. Anytime you have a creation of a composite whole, right, that what becomes something a single common whole. That therefore they share some common end, so common purpose. Now, he says what whether it's continuous, that it comes to it's going to continue, or it's discrete. I mean, it comes in for a purpose, or it comes for one moment and then dissolves after that moment that is accomplished. Right, continuous or discrete. And whether these things are continuous, the same one. Okay, that's what I mean continuous. Continuous in terms of the thing that's coming together. In other words, the number of things, whether it's continuous or they come together for a particular moment thing, that they wish to accomplish, and when they accomplish it, cease. Or in other words, the creation of a community. You form an association to accomplish some goal, right? You're going to commit some goal. But when you come to join to live together, to continuously live together, that's a different. That's going to be more continuous. Whereas coming to some project or something like that, you're not going to. Once the project is accomplished, the purpose for which you came together is no longer valid. Hence, whereas if you're going to choose to live together, and to live together, therefore this foresees a future, and therefore there's going to be continuous stuff. In other words, you create a community in that sense, and therefore there's always going to be this thing. He says, and anytime you have that, you're going to have any kind of situation when you have this constitution of discrete things. You're going to have a situation of those who rule and those who are ruled. A divide. A division of labor, in other words, there's going to be a division of labor. There's going to be a division of organization. This is also what I would argue the basic of this is what Mosca, people like Mosca and Pareto and those guys who talk about the iron law of oligarchy, they argue that in any large scale organization, what's going to happen is any large scale structure of discrete entities coming together, what's going to happen is you can't have everyone participating. There's a limit in participation in that sense. And therefore, what you have is always a few people will ultimately, for this to work effectively, for this to work, only a few people will take the lead and rule. Okay, and I think this is what Aristotle's hinting on here. Um, and he says, um, okay, semicolon 4, and that this is something that animate things derive from all of nature. For even in things that do not partake in life, there is a sort of rule. For example, in a harmony. Okay, in other words, he makes a point about a harmony. That in harmony, there's going to be 23. This is that line. In Greek music, highest note in the tetrachord was known as the leader. Okay, and this is shown in the problems, Aristotle's problems at 9 thing. But let's go back to in other words, even a harmony, even some of it is going to be some any kind of structure. There's going to be a governing principle. There's going to be a thing that, in other words, any kind of construct. There's going to be something that is the thing that orders it, that gives it structure, that makes it. This is the ruling part in that sense. So anything, not only life, but he says that even things that do not partake in life. So everything that is animate is always going to be the ruling part, something that is ruling, and something that will lead, something that will lead, and ruling kind of means that leader, leading, taking the lead. Um, and I think this is, but he even says that material things is going to be something that, and what does leading do? It's okay. We're going to take a certain course. We're going to go a certain direction. We're going to do something. We're going to aim. It's going to it's going to decide what is better, right? And therefore, even in anything, there is the thing is done for some has a reason, or the structure of it, an order to it, and that order has some purpose. Okay. Um, so therefore, this is what he wants to say here. So therefore, even harmony harmony has an order and a logic to it, and that therefore there's a part that is governing. Okay, but these matters perhaps belong more to the external sort of investigation. And again, this is about more kind of like, again, the external sort. The phrase exoterica skeptis appears to refer to the written composition. This is the outside Lyceum, the or the external discourses. Now, Lord does this an introduction about this, but it is sometimes meant to mean merely an investigation of a turn external to the subject. See, it can mean two things. It can be those. There's an argument that Aristotle wrote some written lectures or written essays that has been lost, and these exoteric things are the lectures that's referred to those. Or other scholars have argued that maybe they don't exist. Maybe this is the misinterpretation of this. Rather, this is merely to what he says, and this is for this is for discussions outside of this thing we're doing here. So that both of these are possible meanings by what is this meant of some sort of a more external sort of investigation. Right? I mean, I think Lord translates it the second way in the sense. But an animal is the first thing constituted out of soul and body. So, in other words, it's animals. All the things just have kind of body, matter, a body. Most non-animate things just usually have body. Animate things, living things, have a soul, and it's soul and body, right? So therefore, for the animal is the first thing, and I think he would even say that. Listen, today someone say, but what about viruses or plants? Well, they're living things also. And therefore they're like animals are one of the forms of living things, and they have bodies and souls. The bodies may vary. Okay, so therefore the animal is the first thing constituted out of body and soul, which the former is the ruling element by nature, and the latter is the rule. So the soul rules the body. Not the body rules the soul. The soul rules the body. The soul, and therefore all animals all live like life. The soul of a thing, be it its mind, the soul is psyche here, the psyche, which can mean the mind, or it can mean also the, the mind or the capacity of its sense of its aliveness, um, that and that therefore constitute out of a body and soul. And the former, and one is by ruling element by nature, and the other ruled. It is in these things whose condition is according to nature that one ought to particularly to investigate what is by nature, not in the things that are defective. In other words, this is interesting. Now, we should look towards why the thing is and the purpose of it is, and not pay attention to the things that are defective. We should pay attention when we deal with the conditions of the things within nature by their nature. We should understand them as well. We should look at the ruling part. And the ruling part is sets up what it's for. What it's for. What is it? What is its purpose? What is its a reason for being in that sense? What does it do in that sense? What are these kind of things? And therefore, the condition it is in things whose condition is according to nature that one ought to particularly investigate what is by nature. So therefore, we should look at the things within nature to understand what is meant by nature, not in things that are defective. In other words, we should why defective means the deviancy, the things that are not living the way they should be doing. Thus, the human being to be studied is one whose condition state is both best in body and both in body and soul in him, and this is clear. In other words, we should be looking at man, at the thing at its peak, not in its imperfect state. So the body, we should be looking at perfect bodies, not defective bodies. In other words, in other words, we should be looking at healthy minds and healthy bodies, and this is how what nature is designed for. That the defect, in other words, the defectancies are not intended. They're accidents. They can happen. Accidents can happen, or deviations from or what nature has intended. So there's the idea that nature intends certain things. In other words, in nature, there's a reasoning, a logic, a rationale, and that therefore we should, and we know we can see the rationale, and it's not as the word perfect is the wrong word, but it is perfect. It's it's best form. It's best form. So his condition is both best in body and soul. In him, this is clear. In him, this is clear. For in the case of the depraved, or those in the depraved condition, the body is often held to rule the soul on account of their being in that condition is bad and unnatural. In other words, the body rules the soul. Now, there's something wrong. Now we can say again, this is the big argument about, well, what about I can't control myself. I can't control my desires. So my desires for food or drink or sex lead me to simply engage in it, and what ends up happening is you don't live well. You don't you start to get you're no longer your body does not remain in healthy condition, and what happens is your mind becomes no longer aiming at what is best. It aims at the low things. It's controlled by, in other words, the mind, the soul is now controlled by the desires of the body, fulfilling them, and that's what he would. And this is again something Plato talks about in his Republic. So there is this kind of an agreement here about the question of the soul and the connection between the soul and body, right? Um, 6. It is then in an animal, as we were saying, for that one can first discern both the sort of rule, both the sort of the rule of a master and political life, political rule. So as we look at animals, we can see the origins of, we can see um, this. Why? How does this? We can look at the connection between political rule and masterly despotic and political rule. And this is, we can see this in a certain way. And he says, what? For the soul rules the body with the rule of a master, while the intellect rules the appetite with political and kingly rule. And this is made, and this makes it evident that it is according to nature and advantageous for the body to be ruled by the soul, and the passionate part of the soul by intellect, and having the part having reason, while it is harmful to both if the relation is equal or reversed. So therefore, this is an interesting point he's saying. In other words, the body rules the soul in the animal, in this sense. If the body rules the soul, this is not good. This is not, or this, these are equal. This is not good either. In other words, he says that if there's no rule, if there's not the soul must rule the body. This is how it is. Now regarding the soul itself, the division of the soul between the appetites, which are the connection between the soul and the body. The appetites, the desires, and the appetites are the means of motion. In other words, intellect by itself doesn't move anything. It's desire that moves things. So its desire is the part of the soul that interconnects with the body. Okay, and this is what he's trying to say here is that if they're equal, then it's not going to be that good. In other words, the rational part needs to govern the appetites. If it doesn't, then bad things will happen. If the appetites governs the reason, then this will be usually not for the better, because the appetite doesn't know what's good for it. Doesn't have the ability to discern the beneficial or the harmful, the good and the bad, the just and the unjust. It just knows that I want it. I desire it. Okay, desire is simply I want it. It doesn't tell me it's good or not. I think it's good because I want it. Okay, and Aristotle is saying here, therefore, this is why the rational part, the discerning part, the part that knows what can discern between the advantageous and the disadvantageous, the good versus the bad, the just for the unjust. Because then, therefore, the rational part must guide the appetites. If it's not, if it's they're not, they're on equal footing. Now, or reversed, he says, if they're equal or reversed, this is harmful to both the body and soul. Now, the same holds respect to men and other animals. Tame animals have a better nature than wild ones, and it is better for all of them to be ruled by man, human beings, since in this way their preservation is ensured. In other words, wild animals don't live as long, they don't live as well, they live much shorter lives. A wild cat or a wild dog will not live as a cat in the wild and the cat and things. Well, they will not. If you ever see wild cats and they don't live long, they get and you take feral cats and you get them. And you can see how they don't wild dogs. This is the thing. The modern world romanticizes nature. Nature is by no means the wild world. Is in other words the here Aristotle is kind of hinting. This is where there is an agreement in that sense between Aristotle and Locke about the idea that, but the difference here is that nature is normative in this sense. But the reality of nature is that it's imperfect and that it does. Again, there is this kind of agreement between, and I think this is Locke imitating Aristotle in that sense. Not, and it can't be the other way because Mr. Aristotle is not Locke, right? So the same holds respect to man and other animals. We said about this right there. And since, in other words, it's tame animals are better nature than wild ones, and it's better for all of them to be ruled by man, since in this way their preservation is ensured. Further, the relation to the male to female is by nature a relation of superior to, okay, this is where he gets trouble, right? To inferior, and a ruler to ruled. The same must of necessity hold in the case of human beings generally. Now, he's repeating here a commonly held position. He's just following the logic of this point. Then he says the relationship of male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior, okay, and ruler to ruled. The same must of necessity hold in the case of human beings generally. So, therefore, what is true about um, male and female must there is some kind of superior inferior connection that's governed here. That this is not only true in that case; it must also be true generally. In other words, rule requires that the ruler be superior. In other words, what makes rule legitimate is that the ruler's better. I think that's maybe the problem. It needs to be one needs to be better. The ruler needs to be better or superior to the ruled. If the ruled are superior to the ruling one, that's not right. That's broken. In other words, those who rule should be the better ones. They should be the complete. They should be something better, stronger. That's why reason is better. Reason knows what is can discern, can know about what is beneficial or not. The desires don't know. The body doesn't know per se, and the body can't. The body by itself cannot discern. The soul can. Okay, that's and therefore this is why here, and I think this also explains what is meant by um, the male female thing in this sense. This is the logic in that. Now let's look at the next part. Accordingly, those who are as different from other men as are, in other words, those who are different from other men as the soul from the body or man from beast, and they are in this state or condition if their work is the use of the body. And if this is the best that can come from them, they are slaves by nature. In other words, the most they can do is they're beasts. In other words, if they can only use their, in other words, the only kind of work they can do is with their body. They do not have the mind to do anything higher. their mind, the most they can do is, in other words, they're force. They can only they're the only thing that the way they can work is use their body, and they're more they cannot they do not have the ability to make judgment. They're for some reason they're incapable of discernment and making judgments, or they might or it could be that they can't they always their judgment is always wrong. In other words, the idea here is that the ability to discern judgment and make judgment implies that the judgments you make are correct, not incorrect. So therefore, it's the one who they're innate. By enable doesn't mean they don't make judgments at all. They make judgments, but they assess wrongly always, and therefore they are the. This implies that they are, from the point of view of this, they are more. They're the naturally ruled. They're the slave by nature. This is what he says, which implying, I think, here. They are the slave by nature. The one who can only, in other words, they don't have the ability to, they are like beasts in the sense. They don't have the capacity to discern what is good and advantageous, what is just. They just can work. They can just use their bodies to use their labor. They can do that. They can actually labor. They can do things. But they really don't know, discern about the higher things, the larger questions. Um, for them, it's better to be ruled in accordance with this sort of rule, if such is the case for the other things mentioned. In other words, it's like you're talking about animals, that animals are better than therefore ruled by human beings, so they live longer, they do better. So it's more advantageous for them. An animal, when he's cultivated, it's more advantageous for them in that sense. Aristotle's arguing here. In other words, what about, but is it always advantageous? That if they're going to be chopped up for meat and food, how is this advantageous? Well, the argument is, well, even then it's advantageous for them because they would not have even survived in the wild. The amount of them, the number of them would not have survived in the wild. In other words, that these conditions they have an aspect of life they would it may not be like they're free to do everything, but there is a sense that they have something that they would not have had otherwise. But that's a question. Okay, we don't that's an animal rights question that I'm not going to get into. That's for another discussion. Um, but the idea here is that the slave by nature is what it is one who is simply just they can't discern, right? So therefore he ends like, for them it is better to be ruled in accordance with some sort of rule. If such is the case for the other human beings, the other things mentioned. So therefore, the better one should rule the inferior one. Okay, the one that lacks, that doesn't have it, they need it, right? It's for their good. For he is a slave by nature who is capable of belonging to another, which is also why he belongs to another, and who participates in reason only to the extent of perceiving it, but not to have it. In other words, they can perceive reason, they can kind of see it, but they don't have it. Okay, this is the slave. The slave by nature is that he can perceive something but not possess it, and the other animals, not perceiving reason, obey their passions. Okay, and this is that 25 note. Reading logo with the second manuscript instead of logi, with later reading produces the more usual translation. That is, other animals do not obey reason, though perceiving it through their passion. This is another translation of this translation. Aristotle appears to suggest that the slave differs from even a tame animal by perceiving and obeying reason as distinct from force and habit. So therefore, this is, and Lord is, I think, right here in the sense that this is not to be understood in the more traditional way how this passage is read, but rather arguing that uh, um, uh, the other animals don't even have the capacity to perceive reason. They just obey their passions. Whereas the slave at least perceives it, but doesn't have the ability to engage in it or do it. Moreover, the need, in other words, they only are governed by animals are just merely governed by habit and instinct. In other words, they don't they have a habit and instinct, whereas they don't perceive reason. Humans do. The humans at least perceive humans. The not human slave is the human natural slave still perceives it. He just doesn't possess it. Okay. Moreover, the need for them differs over slightly. Bodily assistance in the necessary things is forthcoming from both, from slaves and from tame animals alike. In other words, because they're slaves and tame animals are useful for their ability for their bodies. This is they're able they're with their bodies they're able to do things. They're capable they have use in that sense. There's an element of use. They are able to do stuff. They have the able to labor or produce something with their bodies. Um, the body therefore bodily assistance is the necessary thing, the necessary things is forthcoming from both slaves and tamed animals. Okay, now he says, nature indeed wishes to make the bodies of free persons and slaves different, as well as their souls. Those with the latter strong with a necessary view to think, necessary needs. Those of the former straight and useless for such tasks, but useful with a view to the political way of life, which is itself divided between the needs of war and those of peace. Okay, wait a minute, that's interesting. So, therefore, it's a useless regards to labor. But war is labor in that sense. I hate to say this, war and peace. Therefore, this is why the political thing, the political way of life, which is divided between the needs of war and those of peace, complicates this simple natural thing. This idea that the nature intends that the okay that the bodies and the souls match. So therefore, the naturally ruled should have bodies. Because the natural slave is that is useful for that his body is useful, so that he should have the powerful bodies. The argument goes because that way this is for the necessary things. This is necessary that their means is through their body, so that they should have powerful bodies. If they don't have the ability to discern things, whereas the people, and if this is going to be beneficial in that sense, the logic is that their bodies, the people whose natural ruler should not have bodies built for laboring, but rather built for their mind should be so constituted that they are able to discern, know how to discern. They have the good souls. Their souls, their minds are able to discern things. And this is what nature, but notice, it wishes this to make. Wishes, not that it makes it this way. This is Aristotle says this is indeed wishes to make bodies this way. Okay, the latter strong with a view to the necessary needs and to those former straight and useless for such tasks. In other words, they cannot be useful to hard labor, but are useful to the political life, which is discernment, judgment. But this is tied, however, which is itself divided between the needs of war and those of peace. Yet the opposite often results. Some having the bodies of free people, while others have the souls. In other words, he says that the reality is nature is not in nature may design one thing one way or intend something or wish something to be that certain way, but the reality of it's mixed up. That it's not always clear that who's the slave and who's the because the body. Some people have the somebody who have the body of a slave, but the mind of a free person, and then or the body of a free person. Or is it things don't fit right in that sense? but have the mind of the slave. Okay, this is this is really the problem that nature doesn't always make it. It's not clear whose soul is what. Okay, um, it is evident at any rate. In other words, some having the bodies of free purpose, or others have the souls. It is evident at any rate that if they were to be born as um, it is evident anyway that if they were to be born as different only in body as the images of the gods, everyone would assert that those not so favored merited being slaves. In other words, if it was clear, in other words, the question of ruler and rule, natural ruler and ruled, if it was clear that the difference between the naturally ruled and the natural ruling was between the bodies and souls of gods, and everyone saw the difference. Everyone would say, okay, that's the mass. That's in other words, there the differences must be significant, huge deviations. In other words, it must be obvious that this person is a master and this person is a slave, natural slave. It has to be obvious. Everyone must agree to it. Both sides. In other words, it can't be. I know. I would be aware of the fact that I am not able to say my do this, and it's better for me to be submit to be ruled by the better. Okay, that is this is the idea. In other words, this. But I have to know that he's or she is better, and everyone needs to know this. This is the problem. It must be evident. Okay, but the problem is in reality it never is evident. Okay, in other words, no, in other words, okay, it is evident that if everyone were to be born different only in the body as the images of the gods, everyone would assert that those not so favored merit being slaves. But if this is true in the case of the body, it is even more justifiable to make this distinction in the case of the soul. Yet it is not easy to see the beauty of the soul as it is that of the body. In other words, we external bodies we can see. We can see. In other words, this is the soul we can't necessarily. We, yes, you can by the actions, their actions and their doings, but it's harder to see it. In other words, the beauty of the soul is not as easy to see as the beauty of the body. And some persons are free and others are slaves by nature, therefore, and that for these slavery is both advantageous and just is evident. In other words, his saying is that there are people whose souls are really so defective that they need to be ruled. And it would be better for them that they're ruled. Now, this is a problem here because we don't it's not evident. It's not clear whose soul. It's more difficult to see our souls. And because there's another problem is those with the inferior souls are not quite willing to admit they're inferior souls. Okay, they think that they're all right. It's not clear. In other words, it's not obvious to them. In other words, it's not obvious to them that actually it may be obvious that they're imperfect, but it's not obvious that that person is better and that and that they're better to the degree that I would be better by them being in charge. You understand? That is the problem. This is the problem here. That it's not plainly evident that this person is truly better, truly naturally better. His soul is such better that that it's so and it is so obvious that even I, who is not a natural master, would recognize it to be so. But if I don't recognize it to be so, I'm not going to submit to it. Okay. So that's the point that he's trying to. I think this is the logic of why this is more complex. While there might be slaves by nature and there might be masters by nature, but doesn't mean that in political reality in life as we know it, that people will recognize it and submit to it. Okay. If it's true that in case of the bodies, it's by the soul, he says that some persons are free and others slave by nature, therefore, and that of these slavery is both advantageous and just. Is that in other words, slavery can only be advantageous if he's the natural slave. But if this is not based, and it must be based on the sense that it's, in other words, in other words, being the slave in this situation, if you're a person who is a natural slave, if you are a natural slave, then being in slavery is your benefit. Being ruled by a master, but being ruled by a master who is truly knowledgeable, truly looking out for your benefit. Okay. Um, Now Aristotle will deal with this a certain way to say this is not how reality is in slavery. Because like the fact that people disagree, it's not going to be that this is how slavery is. Rather, in other words, there, and he's not going to say that because this. In other words, what we have here is a dialogue about the question of slavery, and it's all tied to the question of what slavery. Let's go back to the beginning of this for a second. Of this question is what whether it's whether any one of this sort is there any one of this sort or not. There is, but it's problematic, and it is better just to be one or not. And if they are a by nature a slave, it is better for them and advantageous for them to be a slave. But if they're not one, it is not just and not advantageous for them to be it. And it also is not advantageous for them to be if they are one, but they're not ruled by one who is better. It is not advantageous or beneficial for them as well. So therefore, that's the other thing of this. And the third category here is all slavery against nature. And he's going to say here, no, it's not all slavery against nature. It is rather only the slavery that is based wholly only on coercion. In other words, it's the coercion and enslaving of those who are by their natures free. And who is a free person? A free person is one whose nature can discern, who's have the ability to discern what is advantageous and not advantageous, what is good and just and what's not. What is just and what is just and unjust, what is good and bad, what is advantageous, disadvantageous. In other words, the just and unjust, good and bad, advantageous, disadvantageous, the ability to know that and discern it. Okay. So we leave in chapter 5 with this point where we end at here. And that's going to stop here. Okay, that's it for today. If you like it, like it. First, please, any comments or questions you have, please post them here. If I see them, I'll respond to them. If you liked what you had to do, like it. If you didn't like it, say why. Please share it with a friend. If you want to get more notices, subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. If you think you share it with a friend, share it on social media or just notify a friend about this. If you want to follow me on social media, you can do so below. The links are below. If you want to be a contributor to help with this, you can do it through Subscribestar or through Patreon, or you can buy Lulu or Amazon. If you go to Amazon, I make less money, but okay, it's Lulu charges you shipping, so maybe you want to save money in shipping. It's a notebook for Aristotle's politics. Again, we're doing politics. It's a study guide. It's a kind of work. It's a kind of Cliff's Notes on the politics. And it's a good. It's not being read in substitute of the politics, but it's a very good book, useful book to go with it. So if you want to, contribute or help, you can go buy it. That's it for today. We'll tomorrow or the next session, we will look at chapter 6. And so that's it. Have a good day. Take care. Bye bye.